Well, I got some great feedback about last week, and so we're going to continue on in this idea of having emotionally healthy relationships. And so I'm going to start out, I'm going to tell you a story. So it was 1993. I had just graduated from high school. That was like 10 years ago, right? The 90s were just 10 years ago. I was starting out in junior college that summer and taking some music classes, and I was taking some very specific instrument classes. One was bass guitar. And a kid from high school who had graduated a year before me, he was a year older than me, he had come up to me one day in our lessons and he said, "Hey, there's these two dudes starting a Christian rock band, and they need a bass player. Maybe, I figured that's more your vibe because it's really not mine." So here I was, I go meet these guys. I'm 18 years old. I've got hair down past my shoulder blades. And this guitar player is like 30 years old, and he's a huge fan of the Beatles and tries to mimic the Beatles in everything he does and writes. And then the drummer at that time was like 41 and was a 70s style rock drummer still in the 90s. And then there's me, this long-haired, metal-loving kid who was ready to throw up his rock fist and headbang. And so it was a weird combination, to say the least. But I was just excited to be with some other guys that play music. It was my first real come together with other musicians and write our own songs for Jesus. And we called ourselves Unchained Heart. We were probably more like, somebody goes, Unchained Melody. I go, no, we were more like Not a Great Melody. Fast forward years later, I have a garage sale, and we're sitting out in the garage with my son, and he pulls up a tape cassette of this band Unchained Heart. He says, "Dad, what's this?" And I said, "Oh, that's a tape of a band I was in back when I was about 18, 19 years old when I met your mom." And he goes, "No, I mean physically, what is this?" That's a whole nother story, teaching him about cassette tapes. So I pop it in, we play it, and he's like, "Oh, okay, all right." So he goes, "Well, what's this one?" And I said, "Well, that was this rock band, Christian rock band I was in called Rushing Sledge." Right? Doesn't that sound way cooler than Unchained Heart? Right? I played that, and he's like, "Oh, okay, Dad." He liked that one. I never thought Unchained Heart was all that bad. I mean, I knew we weren't great, but I didn't think we were all that bad until this little boy standing in the garage listened to it, and he's like, "Yeah, I like that rock band way better, Dad, that one." And I was like, "But I wrote a song, and these kids took it to their church camp, and they made it their theme song. I wrote songs that somebody actually liked." Didn't matter, because the reality was we weren't that good. And it turns out that the person who lies the most to me is me. Perhaps you're like me, and the person who gets in the way the most is me. I've tried for years to solve this dilemma, right? So our lives, they tend to be like an iceberg. You know how an iceberg, you can only see what's above the water. You can see the top of it, but that's only like 10% of the iceberg, right? The dangerous part of the iceberg, the thing that really makes it an iceberg, is the 90% that's under the water. So the 10% for us would be what we show the world. The 10% is what we say, what we do, what we post, what we tweet. We'll call that our visible personality. So then there's this 90% that's below the surface. It's the stuff that drives our behaviors. It's our motivations. It's our things we learned growing up in our families. It's our deep-seated beliefs and even our unconscious motivations. So here's what's important about today's talk as we go through this. So much of your marriage, your friendships, your work life, your home life hangs in the balance, not based on the 10%, but based on the 90% and what you choose to do with it. How often do we do a Titanic and we shipwreck relationships because we ignore what is going on in the 90% below the surface? How often have we ended a relationship based on what we projected on the other person? And then we rarely ever own and deal with the 90%. So now if you're new to Christianity, or you're still trying to figure out how to walk with Jesus, here's something for you. Jesus was courageous enough to deal with the 90%. And then he invites us to do the same. So welcome tonight. You've braved the cold and the ice and the snow. Thankfully, the sun came out and melted the roads a little bit today. My name's Ryan, and I'm so glad that you're here as we start this second week talking about healthy relationships. Because these ideas over the next few weeks, these practices, they'll help us as we learn to walk with Jesus and learn to love others. Last week we talked about clarifying expectations. How many of you found yourself throughout the week using or thinking about that in your relationships with others? I did it. Michelle and I had a few discussions, and I would start to get a little upset, and I stopped and I said, you know what? That's my bad. I had an expectation that I have not expressed to you yet. So I'm sorry, let's try this again. And it's kind of wild how great that works in your relationships with someone that means something to you. And I assumed that it would with people who I just need to have relationships with, like in the workplace, wherever it is I'm at. And so this week we're going to talk about self-awareness. Now, I hope, don't do like me and the first time you hear that, you kind of, self-awareness, that sounds like some new agey weird thing. It's not. And we'll define that and we'll unpack that here in the next few minutes. Now, thinking about the iceberg, self-awareness is where we're going to look down at the 90% and making ourselves aware of what's going on down there. The things that we're typically not aware of. Now, the term being self-aware is maybe a new term that we use, but the idea is not. And Jesus presupposes this idea in Matthew 5:7 when he says, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So see, we've always been about judging others. Always pointing out the tiniest thing we find wrong in them. But then we have this huge thing going on with ourselves. Maybe we should deal with that. As my father and mother would say, hey, take care of yourself. That's a big enough problem for you to handle. But in order to look at this plank, I'll have to become self-aware that it's there. Now, Jesus would have you become self-aware, but perhaps not for the reason we've attached to it in the modern Western civilization. Because see, remember when Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? What is this life ultimately about? By those religious contemporaries of his time. He replied by summing up 600 Old Testament commandments into these two verses that become a coat peg that we can hang all of our lives on. Remember, Jesus replied and he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, and the second is like it. Love people. I'll say it this way. All of life is about deepening our love of God and deepening our love for other people. Jesus says the second is like the first because how we treat creation, God's creation, people, reflects on how we feel about the Creator. So if the self-awareness is not learning to love God and learning to love people, then we're not becoming our best selves according to Jesus. Now, if we're not careful, the pursuit of self-awareness can become narcissism in disguise if it's not directed into loving God and loving people. Jesus said in John, the truth will set you free. You and I can only love people well when we live in the truth about ourselves and not in denial. If all truth belongs to God, then understanding the truth about ourselves is so important in our relationship with God. Maybe you hear the term self-awareness, and it brings up some stuff because you've heard this term before. And you're like, what's this weird touchy-feely stuff? What's this modern concept all about? But tonight I'd ask you to lean in because it's a conversation where we have to be vulnerable and we have to have some emotional courage if we want to grow in it and not continue to avoid it. See, it's easy to distract ourselves from this conversation, but I'd ask tonight, give it a chance. Maybe this conversation of self-awareness is discouraging because you already know of things you don't like about yourself, and you feel like maybe we're going to add fuel to that fire. But I want you to know, Jesus is not inviting you to self-condemnation. Because the Bible says there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. He's not inviting you to self-judgment. He's inviting you to self-compassion. So what that means for the Christian is accepting God's compassion for the 90% that we'll never know completely. Understanding that God knows us, everything about us, and yet he still loves us all the same. So today's challenge will resolve to view self-awareness as a journey, not as something to achieve, but by grace to receive as we go on this journey with Jesus. And it's not only for your sake, but it's for the sake of your relationships. What is self-awareness anyways? The Harvard Business Review describes it in two functions. The first is internal self-awareness, how well you know yourself or your intentions. How well you understand your emotional life. The messages from your childhood and your family and how they impact your personality and your motivations. It's an internal introspective self-awareness. The Business Review went on to say that there's an external view that we often don't talk about. How well you understand others see you. What is your impact on others? See, self-awareness doesn't just happen with self-knowledge. It's important to also understand how I impact the people around me and how I come across. I could probably tell a bunch of stories about things I hear others say sometimes, and I go, oh wow, did I come across that way? And so looking in is not always just about self-awareness, but how am I impacting these people? How am I coming across to them? Now Jesus, he was a master of self-awareness. And for our purposes today, we'll look at his self-awareness, particularly in his emotions. We as Christians believe that we've been made in the image of God, as Genesis says. So God has emotions. God is a God who experiences emotion, and we are made in his image. That's out in Genesis 1. And we see God's grief over the sinfulness of man when we read Genesis 6. And then his anger and jealousy as he communicated through the prophets of the Old Testament. Now we read that through Exodus and Joshua. God's anger and jealousy over his people. And then God has joy and compassion for his people all throughout the scriptures. We can find that in Psalms and Zephaniah and Isaiah. However, don't miss this idea. God has emotions, but he has a perfect relationship with his emotions. We do not. How you grew up, you inherited a certain view of emotions. Perhaps emotions weren't to be trusted, a negative association that maybe we don't want to listen to them. And in fact, let's just press them down and not even make time for them. Let's just not even deal with our emotions. I know so many times in my life, I can look back and I can remember, oh, that's an emotional response. I have no time for that. I only want to deal with the facts. You know, I was like Joe Friday from Dragnet. Just the facts, ma'am. I don't care about emotions. So the other side of that spectrum, though, was those families whose emotions were all-consuming. Your emotions, go be expressive with them. Let them lead you. Go be driven by your emotions as much as possible. But now, see, and those were the people that used to, I would say, I don't have time for you. And I would just push that down out of the way because for some reason I had decided, and I don't know if it was in my childhood or if it was something in my career. But our biblical view of emotions is way more neutral than those two ideas. Emotions should not drive us. However, they shouldn't be dismissed by us. See, emotions, they're data for us. Emotions are the data that the Spirit of God uses to influence us, to shape us, and to guide us. Because ultimately, we are led by God and His Spirit. And we remember that Jesus is fully human and He's fully divine. So being fully human, He experienced the full range of human emotions. He experienced the positive emotions, joy and happiness. And He also experienced what we're going to look at, those tougher emotions. Did you know that Jesus felt anger? The popular verse, and we're going to look at it tonight, Mark 11, Jesus goes into the temple and He begins driving out the people who are buying and selling there. He overturns the table of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and He wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as He taught them, He said, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. And so what's going on in this scene is that the people have made the temple a place of commerce. But not just that, they were price gouging the poor, making livestock more and more expensive so that they couldn't afford a sacrifice for atonement of sin, and thus keeping them in that day and time of Jewish culture from having a relationship with God. So when you see Jesus here, he's walking in and He sees all this. And it brings up this strong emotion where now He drives out these animals and these people. Now what's interesting is the word anger is not mentioned. In John's account, he uses the word zeal. John 2:17, His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Which zeal means passion for God. And if anything, the Gospels kind of downplay Jesus' anger and what is probably the clearest expression of emotion in the New Testament. Now Mark, he gives us a little more insight into this. Mark 11:11. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus didn't just walk into the temple, make this whip, and start driving everybody out. He sees it, and there's a day's interval. See, Jesus sees what is happening. He feels what he feels, and then he comes back a day later to clear out the sanctuary. Many commentators would say that Jesus' actions here were very thought out and carefully premeditated. See, it's a prophetic statement against people actually believing that they had to buy their relationship with God. In John's account, Jesus says, I am the temple to end all temples. So him wiping this all away shows what he is about to do in the name of God. Rather than react in a moment, Jesus returns after a day and responds where he used his anger to make a statement about injustice and the redemptive work that he had come to do. See, and when we sense injustice, and if anger is data, what is this telling us? That there's a perceived injustice. We have to react to balance the scales in some way. If we react negatively, perhaps we lash out, or we start to critique people, or we become numb to it, and we just hold it down until one day we burst in a fit of rage. But Jesus, he does this differently, and he invites us to process our anger in such a way that we would respond rather than react. In the midst of anger, Jesus invites us to respond instead of react. And that's what Jesus did. And he shows us we can respond to create change rather than add fuel to a fire. Do you know Jesus felt sadness? Jesus' closest friend, Lazarus, he's died. And Jesus shows up in Bethany to see Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, and they're grieving. Now we know, reading the text, that further on is that Jesus' plan when he gets there is to raise Lazarus from the dead. And he even delayed his arrival so that the kingdom of God could be displayed through this miracle. And Jesus knows that once this happens, people are going to be shouting and singing and dancing and rejoicing. But in that moment, Jesus responds to Mary and Martha in this way. John 11, 33 and 35 says that when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And probably the most epic verse of the Bible we've ever known throughout our Christian walk is verse 35. Jesus wept. The Son of God didn't rush to his resolution. He took the time to enter into their grief and pain with them of losing a loved one. Now, typically when my wife comes to me with a problem, or anyone does, I just go into fix-it mode. I grab my tools, I say, can we fix it? Yes, we can. I'm Bob the Builder of problem fixing. You didn't know that existed, did you? But in John, we see this Jesus who we know can fix this, but not only can he fix it, he can erase sadness in that moment. Jesus didn't even have to take the time to enter into pain with them. But what does he do? He attunes to the emotional climate before he fixes. He sits with them before he suggests, to help the other people feel that they were felt. See, it's in the midst of sadness, Jesus invites us to process our own pain and attune to the suffering of others. Sadness, we often look at as a problem emotion to be kept at bay. What psychologists have told us over the year about sadness is that it's really important to experience sadness. That way you can come through your experience and fully move forward. In other words, if we do not experience sadness or process the loss we're experiencing, we won't be able to move forward in life. See, sadness is about processing what you've lost, whether it's a small thing or a big thing. It's about sitting down with your discouragement and sitting down with your disappointment. Unprocessed emotions, they don't die. They get buried alive. And when we try to do a thing where we numb certain emotions, we're really numbing all of our emotions. Because we can't selectively choose what we do and don't feel. So we just end up keeping everything tamped down. And remember, if emotions are data, then sadness is trying to tell us something about our experience that we can process so that we can move forward in life. Then we can attune and care for other people. Show me a person who's not dealt with their own sadness, and I'll show you a person who doesn't know how to empathize with other people. Jesus felt fear. fully human, fully divine. God stepped out of heaven. Jesus felt fear. Mark 14, they went to a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And Jesus says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He said to them, "Stay here and keep watch." And so in this verse of Jesus, we see this cocktail of emotions. There's extreme anguish, distress, anxiety. And the Greek word that's used here in the original text was sorrow. It's a rare word. And what it really means is beyond sorrow. And the writers here, they're struggling to try to articulate the kind of emotional pain Jesus is undergoing. So much so that it's really even a mystery to us. We really don't know how to describe it. And Jesus had experienced something that we can't comprehend. I mean, he's going to have the betrayal of his friends and his followers, there's public ridicule, carrying the weight of the entire world's sin and death. Jesus, even at one point, he prays and he says, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by." But ultimately, Jesus says, "Not my will, but your will be done." And the cup, it's a Hebrew idiom for God's wrath. See, Jesus manages somehow in all this stress to have a clear picture that he will bear the weight of the entire sin of the world. This entire wrath of God. And I can't even begin to imagine what that experience would be like. And Jesus is the only person in human history to genuinely experience God's forsakenness. The only person to experience the complete and utter separation from God, a complete hell here on earth. Nothing could compare to that kind of suffering. And the disciples who could never understand that, Jesus says to them, "Come here, stay with me." In the midst of fear, Jesus leans into relationship. He doesn't pull away, but he leans into his closest friends. Even knowing that they're all going to run away. They're going to deny him, and one of them is going to literally stab him in the back. But Jesus is open-hearted. Jesus' fear did not lead him to isolate. It allowed him to be humble enough to allow others to care for him. Part of following Jesus with our whole hearts is bringing God into our emotional process and understanding this internal self-awareness and how we in turn impact other people. Instead of using God to avoid our emotions, we should bring God into it. To choose curiosity about our emotional process rather than condemnation. A lot of Christians or people who've experienced with church or religion, they do this thing called spiritual bypassing. This is a new term for me, so I'll explain it to you also. And so I'm going to give you an example of that's going to be real practical about what this looks like, how it plays out, and the journey of becoming more self-aware with our emotions. So we'll start off with sadness. And this isn't concrete definitions or ideas, but this is to give you an idea of what this looks like. See, the spiritual bypass would say, you don't need to be sad. God has given you so much. But emotional health would say, you know what? Part of me feels sad today. I'm curious what that is about. I'm going to need to bring this to God in prayer. And maybe my mentor. Maybe somebody you look up to. You could say, hey, this is what's going on, and I've brought it to God in prayer. I thought I'd bring it up with you too. And we notice that in that second idea, there's this leaning into God and also into a relationship with this response. anger. The spiritual bypass is to ask God to take your anger away. And I got to tell you, somebody who has fought with and dealt with being a hothead and being quick to anger in the past, God doesn't just take your anger away. As much as I would have rather He'd done that, rather than the trouble it got me into. But when we slow down, you know the Bible says, don't be quick to anger. So the emotional health would be, I feel angry at him or her. I don't want to take it out on them, but I'm not quite sure where this is coming from. I think I'll journal about this. I'll write this down, and maybe I'll discuss it in a small group, or maybe I'll discuss it with someone I trust, someone who's close to me. And again, we're looking upward and we're looking at relationship. We're looking to God and we're looking to others. Now, fear, the spiritual bypass is just die to your fear. It's the enemy of faith. So just die to your fear. It's the enemy of faith, right? That's the spiritual bypass. But emotional health would say, you know, I'm fearful of what they might think of me. I want to understand this fear so it doesn't rule me. And I need to process this with a safe person. I want to invite you to explore this idea of self-awareness. What's going on beneath the surface? You know, what's beyond what we show people? So remember how last week I asked you to choose that one person to practice these emotional healthy practices with or on? Think about that person. Think about the last time you had a conflict with them. Sit down and process that conflict and write out some answers to these 4 questions. And I put these on your notes so that you can sit down, meditate and work on this and write that out. But you know, number 1, what emotions did this conflict produce in me? What did it do to me when we were in this conflict? And number 2, if emotions are data, what was this particular emotion communicating to me about this experience? Number 3, what challenge did I create for the other person? And challenge is a nice word sometimes for what problem did I create for them? And number 4, Jesus, what step are you inviting me into? Because we remember Jesus always has a next step for us. He's always moving us forward, calling us into a new place to be better than we were the day before. Holiness isn't something we're going to achieve in this life, but it's something we still chase after we chase after Jesus. We constantly are taking steps to be more like Jesus. So Jesus, what's the next step you're inviting me into? Well, God, I thank you that you've given us an outline for how to walk through this life and work in relationships, and that it's not that our emotions are bad, but our emotions tell us things that we can know about ourselves so that we can learn better how to treat ourselves and to treat those around us. And God, would you continue to work in us and teach us to love you better and love you more. And then likewise in the same, that will love the people around us. Pray this in Jesus' name.